Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're very excited to share this space with you. We're going to be talking about the limitations of the law, centering immigrant voices in the fight to end immigrant detention. My name is Laura Duarte Bateman. I'm the communications manager with California Collaborative for Immigrant Justice. And joining me are three amazing panelists that I'm going to introduce now. So I'm going to start with Serafin. Serafin Andrade is an organizer detained at the Mesa Verde detention facility. He has been in detention since June 4th, 2021, and has begun organizing to expose the inhumane conditions inside detention and to improve them for several months now. Two of his favorite hobbies are crocheting and reading. So hello, Serafin. We're very excited to have you here with us.
Hi, everybody. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. And next is Lisa Knox. Lisa is CCIJ's legal director. She oversees CCIJ's work in creating and supporting strategies to fight for the liberation of immigrants in detention through direct representation, litigation, and advocacy. As a person of Black and Latinx descent, Lisa's lived experiences have taught her that immigration is a racial justice issue. Hi, Lisa. So good to be here with you.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here today.
And last but not least, Edwin Carmona Cruz is the Community Engagement Director at CCIJ. Edwin leads CCIJ's statewide campaigns, participatory defense, rapid response, the Vaccine Education and Empowerment and Detention Program, also called VED. This is a program which connects individuals detained in immigration detention centers with trusted medical professionals that can provide culturally and linguistically competent information regarding the COVID-19 vaccine. So hi, Edwin. So happy to be here with you.
That was a mouthful, but thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Y'all are so amazing. I mean, we could just have a panel about all of your incredible bios, but let's get to it. Let's get started with Lisa. Lisa, I'm wondering, for those of us who may not be familiar with the idea of immigration detention, if you could talk to us a little bit about some of the backgrounds, about what it is, who ends up in immigrant detention, and who profits from it.
Yeah, so first, one thing that might surprise people is that every single person who's in an immigration detention center, they're only there because they're a non-citizen. And so what do I mean by that? So the immigration detention system is supposed to be a civil system, right? That means that it's not punishment. People aren't there as punishment for a crime, for example. People are only there so that they show up to court or show up for their deportation if they're going to be deported. So that means, again, every single person who is in an immigration detention center today, were they a citizen, they wouldn't be there. And so let's talk a bit about how people get into the immigration detention system. So many of you have heard of ICE. That's the agency that's in charge of immigration enforcement. And so when they encounter someone who they believe is deportable, right, either because they have never had legal status in the US, or that status can be taken away for some reason, they have authority to do a few different things. They can just release that person with a notice that they have to appear in court. They can detain that person, but give them a bond. And some people, if ICE denies them a bond, they also get to ask a judge for a bond. And so that's supposed to do something called mitigate flight risk, right? So if people who ICE thinks maybe aren't so inclined to show up to court, they may make them pay a bond so that they're more likely to do so. And then what's supposed to be the last resort for ICE is to detain people with no bond, meaning they have to stay in detention while the deportation process plays out, while they fight their deportation. And so who ends up in that process? So there's a lot of different people that end up in this deportation process and in detention. You might be surprised to know that asylum seekers, many of you have probably seen the news of asylum seekers at the border who are trying to get into the United States, who are fleeing their home countries. Many of those folks will be detained once they get into the US. Some of the people in detention are people who finished a criminal sentence or were given bail out of criminal detention. So after the criminal legal system decided to release them into their communities, then they're picked up by ICE. And so some of those people are subject to something called mandatory detention, which means they can't get a bond. And so basically it means the whole time they're fighting their case, they're going to be in a detention center. And for some people, that can be years. So really for this reason, I look at detention as a form of kidnapping, right? The state and ICE is really taking people from their communities, in some cases, literally holding them for ransom, right? A lot of people in detention have bonds, but are there because it's too high and they can't pay it. And so that's the deportation and detention system that we're working within. And another thing I want to emphasize is that we use the word detention, but when we say detention, we're really talking about jail, right? People are being locked in places against their will, in jail-like conditions that we'll hear more about. And in some cases, they're literally in jails. A number of county jails have contracts with ICE to hold people for ICE. So there are people who are literally in a jail right now. Basically, they just get a different colored jumpsuit than people who are there because they're going through the criminal legal system, but it's literally the same conditions and situation. And another thing that many people don't know is that nationwide, 73% of immigrants are in for-profit detention centers. So that means that these private corporations, Geo Group is the biggest, but there's others, they're literally making money and profiting off of caging immigrants. And really, the worse the conditions are, the more money they make, because they have contracts with ICE for a fixed number of beds for a fixed amount, right? And so it incentivizes them to spend less of that money on taking care of the folks who they're detaining. And so, as we'll hear from Serafine and from Edwin shortly, there's failures to provide medical care. They don't provide proper meals or nutrition, all because this means more profits for those companies. And so now I'd like to pull up the slideshow. And I want to show you a little bit of how these corporations sort of advertise the detention centers versus the reality. So this is a picture of the Adelanto Detention Center, which is like 90 minutes outside of Los Angeles. It's pretty isolated in a town that's literally nothing but prisons and detention centers. So this is a promotional shot that Geo Group, the corporation that runs it, sent out. So you see on the left, they have a soccer field. On the right, there's some other fields. It looks like they have shade up for people who might want to use those. So they portray it as not so bad. And if we can move to the next picture, here's a close-up of the soccer field that they say is there for people, right? Again, their corporate propaganda tries to portray detention as humane, right? That people are being held here, but it's kind of like a summer camp. Like they play games, there's soccer fields. And as we'll see in the next slide, well, here's another slide that shows the benches and the water they supposedly have out for people. And let's go to the next slide. So this next slide starts to show us the reality. And so the next few pictures were taken by a journalist who went inside the Adelanto Detention Center. And this is where most people are spending their time, right? They're in these really cells where they're locked inside for most of the day. You see here, there's some guards letting someone out, but unless a guard goes in and locks the door, people can't get out even to use the bathroom. Let's go to the next slide. And this is what the inside of one of those cells looks like. And frankly, this one's actually pretty nice. Like they probably had painted it and cleaned everything before they let a reporter in. Usually it's not in this good of a condition even. But even on its best day, right? This is a windowless room that's really small that people are stuck in for most of the time. Let's go to the next slide. And so this is a picture looking into the dining hall. Again, people don't get exposed to natural light. The few windows that exist are to the inside, usually not to the outside. This is looking a lot like a jail or prison, right? And I think there may be one more slide. No, it's at the end. Okay, so yeah, so that's just a little taste. And again, right, this is a reporter who went in, so they absolutely cleaned it up. I've been to Adelanto. It doesn't look that nice on a normal day. But this is the reality that folks are living in inside detention.
Thanks so much, Lisa. That's super helpful to have your insight, a person who's been inside these detention centers and can actually tell us what they look like. I try to not to laugh, but again, I just find it so mind-blowing that the 3 pictures that they have up in their website are like soccer fields when we're talking about jailing people inside of cages. So thank you so much for that insight. And, moving forward, Edwin, I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about what that Lisa just described, what it looks like nationwide, and what it looks like in California, and what it looks like in Wisconsin specifically, because we're very fortunate to be able to bring these two states together and have this conversation between what immigration detention looks like in California and in Wisconsin.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lisa brings up a really good point. I've been to Adelanto as well. So in the highway, you're still getting off the highway and going miles into the high desert in California. So it's really isolated. But with respect to your question, Laura, what does detention look like nationwide? Congress actually by law has codified or has put in a number in the law that at any moment there needs to be 34,000 beds available. And as organizers, as advocates and attorneys, as we know, the more beds that are available, the more enforcement there is, the more that ICE is in our communities, separating our families. And so, but the really interesting part is that somehow Congress and whoever is president, really seems to believe that 34,000 beds need to be filled in at every single moment. At one point, there was 36,000 individuals detained in immigration detentions across the country. But at the height of the pandemic, we saw that there were about 13,000 individuals detained in ICE custody. And this is the lowest number that we've seen in several years. But it's really difficult to even say, well, thanks to politicians. In actuality, it was through litigation, it was through community organizing and pressure where the community forced the administration, forced these facilities to release people. Right. And so at one point, we have to remind ourselves that the presidential administration can depopulate these facilities at any moment. Again, that they said, we have to keep these beds open. Actually, you don't. We're seeing 13,000 people at one point were in detention, and, everyone is fine. As Lisa mentioned, this is a civil issue. Unfortunately, as of April of 2020 of this year, that number has now increased to 18,800. It is still a little below 20,000, but as I like to say, we'll be happy when there's 0 people in detention, when there are 0 beds available to detain and deport our community members. And so this is a victory for the movement. This is a victory for community organizers and advocates, legal service providers across the country. However, we are seeing a huge increase in the Alternatives to Detention program, ATD. And again, don't be fooled. This is still a level of incarceration. It's actually called e-carceration or electric carceration. And we're seeing a huge increase in budgets for technology that is very frightening. The level of surveillance that is being developed to track immigrants is something that we should all be really scared about. And this is technology that comes up as ankle shackles or ankle monitors. Very, very uncomfortable monitors on your ankles. There's a lot of a stigma behind ankle monitors, ankle shackles, right? You're not allowed to leave a radius around your home. There's also curfews. You folks need to be back home at a certain time where ICE will call them and check up, hey, are you home now, right? Phone calls, app calls, and also physical check-ins with ICE. People have to take days out of their work, days out of being with their families to go report to ICE. Oftentimes people spend hours in these buildings to check in, they get a signature, and then they leave, right? And this is, for whatever reason, this is how ICE and the administration wants to track immigrants. And so, again, we're still fighting to depopulate these facilities and shut these facilities down. Like I mentioned before, the more beds that are available, the more enforcement there is in our community. Now, there is a situation here where we look at California and Wisconsin, right? California has 8 detention facilities. 7 are privately owned and operated. And one is, like Lisa mentioned, one is a county jail that has a contract with ICE, an intergovernmental service agreement. And so in this case, every single person in detention, except for 4 people in the state of California, are detained in a privately owned and operated detention facility. In this case, the biggest is the GEO Group Incorporated. And so California has the second largest, is the second state with the second largest and highest number of deportations. I'm going to share with you all a tab of an interactive map that is available to everyone, where we can see the numbers here, where California, we see total deportations is 827,420 individuals. And Wisconsin here is a total deportations of 26. But again, this number, don't be fooled, not that Wisconsin deports less people, but people have to make a journey from states like Wisconsin down to California, down to Arizona and Texas, where where folks are slated to be deported and just dumped on the other side of the border. Let's see if I can return back to my screen. Here you go.
That's a good point. And Edwin, I have a real quick question for you. Because you were sharing before that the number of immigrants detained right now is around 18,000. Can you talk to us a little bit about, is that the whole number of people detained in a year, or, how does that work? Because it seems like a low number, but I do know that it's not, that it's just going to be 18,000 people. So can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Absolutely. That number isn't just a fixed number. That number is actually a number that stays relatively stagnant over time, but we have to keep in count the level of deportations, the level of releases, new people that are coming in, that are being detained, whether they're from our communities or whether they're coming from the border or wherever that might be. So that number tends to fluctuate, but that's like a little snapshot in our time of the number of people that are currently detained at this moment. It's, we just finished the month of May. We're about to finish the month of May and getting into June, but we'll get additional numbers in terms of the level of people who are in detention. But again, this isn't to celebrate the Biden administration or any elected office that, wow, the numbers are below 20,000. Again, this is through a community legal partnership. This is through organizing and other litigation efforts that have been forcing the government to release people in the middle of a raging pandemic, an ongoing pandemic. And the last thing that I was going to mention is, there's a lot of, we talk about, California and the promised land and whatever that might be. And, but I still want to make sure that we talk about all the different types of efforts that are happening, even here in Wisconsin, where, in 2019, a privately owned and operated facility was set to open in the city of New Richmond, where about 500 beds were going to be open in that community. And this is a community that actually voted for Trump. And they stood up together and said, no, we don't want a prison, a jail in our community, detaining our community members. And so individuals in New Richmond organized and were able to stop this private corporation called Centers of America to no longer do business in that community. And similar situations happened in California, where at least in the Bay Area, we were able to shut down terminate two contracts in the Bay Area through organizing, through legal services, through litigation. The West County Detention Facility in Richmond, not New Richmond, but in Richmond, California, and the Rio Consumes Correctional Center, RCCC, that contract ended. So there's a lot of really there are a lot of similarities between the types of tactics and the types of strategy that is being used in Wisconsin and California and Texas and Arizona and across the country, that this isn't just a California issue, this is a nationwide issue.
That's right, yes. And thank you so much for bringing up that experience that we learned from in Wisconsin, that they were able to stop that detention center. And if there's local folks listening in and know about that, we'd also love to hear if you can drop it in the comments section. We'd love to also learn more about that from local folks, because we just read it in the news, so that would be very nice. And I'm actually going to bring Serafin into the conversation. And we're very lucky to have Serafin here with us. As you can tell, he has an image, a static image. He's not here on video, but he is here with us through the phone. He's detained at Mesa Verde Detention Facility. He was initially detained at Golden State Annex in McFarland, California, then transferred to Mesa Verde in Bakersfield, California. And it's been almost a year since you've been detained, Serafin. And I'm wondering if you can paint a picture of what those detention centers you've been in are like. What has your life been like through the last year? If you could sort of describe that to us.
Yes, thank you. When I was picked up by ICE upon my release date from state prison, it took approximately 19 hours to finally be able to go to sleep in a housing unit. These detention centers are inhumane, they're degrading, and it's a war of attrition upon all of us who are housed within their walls. The food service in the dining hall isn't nutritious. The majority of the meals that they feed us are processed food that looks, smells, and tastes old. The servings are very small. We don't get any vegetables, fruit. If we're able to shop in the commissary for food, the prices are very high. Not to mention, any healthy choices are very limited and they're very expensive. And even then, pastries come moldy, sausages come expired, so the food is just terrible. And then the living conditions, they're terrible. The windows are sandblasted, so we can't even look outside. The dorm and water in the showers is cold in the winter and hot in the summer. We sleep on very thin mattresses and given blankets that don't even keep us warm. The linen in the laundry is old, worn, torn, and even stained. The Performance-Based National Detention Standard, PBNDS, says that the facility is supposed to provide us at no cost to the detainees with indoor and outdoor temperature appropriate clothing. Yet we're faced to purchase from commissary some of these items, while most of us are not able to afford. For those who work for $1 a day, they will need to save up for a whole month in order to be able to buy a pair of shorts or sweatpants. The medical negligence is a recurring theme. Tylenol is a solution for most pains, and even then it's denied to several. In an effort for the facility to save money, the length of our confinement plays a big part in the proper medical care we receive. I've seen an individual with a herniated disc endure daily pain because medical refused to give him pain medication and referred him for surgery. Now the choice is left for many of us with the lesser of two evils: remain incarcerated to endure the constant harassment, decriminalization by detention officers, and the conditions that affect us physically, emotionally, and mentally, or return to a country where many of us haven't returned since we were children. We all face the decision of permanent family separation, leaving our families behind, and or a fear to return to our country.
Wow, super powerful testimony. Thank you so much, Serafin, for sharing. You really did a great job in drawing that image for us. And, going back to what Edwin was talking about, how people come in and out of this deportation machine, right? And then Serafin's also is sharing that as well. The conditions are it's made to break people's spirits. And so people are also coming in and out very quickly. So Lisa, now that we've known a little bit about these conditions, what these conditions are like, why immigrant detention becomes that deportation machine from the legal perspective, what are some of the reasons why some people are deported, so many people are deported, and why they can't have a chance to fight their case?
Yeah, so great question. There's so many reasons. So I'll kind of briefly go through a few of the biggest ones. And I think, as Serafin mentioned, and as Laura just said, it really is a deportation machine, right? The whole detention system is designed to discourage people from fighting their cases and to break their spirits. And the legal side of the system, I believe, is also designed to do the same. And so one of the first barriers is there's a right to counsel if you can pay for it or find someone willing to represent you for free. So unlike the criminal legal system, where everyone has a right to be represented, people in immigration detention do not get a public defender or a free lawyer assigned to them. And as we talked about before, most people are being detained in pretty isolated areas, pretty far away from legal service organizations who might be able to help them for free, or immigration attorneys who might be able to help them if they could afford to pay. And if people can afford to pay, it's a big if, because it's expensive, right? Private attorneys can charge a lot of money, in part because the work is pretty complex, and because the cases move so quickly, they usually want money up front. So people can be looking at having to come up with several $1,000s pretty much immediately. And there's other costs associated with fighting your deportation. The only thing that is free to apply for is asylum. Other applications, other things that people might apply for to try and stop their deportation require payment. And then people on top of that might need to pay expert witnesses, psychologists, pay for people in their home country to send documents. So the cost can really add up. And just to give one example, if somebody is eligible and wants to apply for a green card, the fees for that are about $1,800, right? So even if someone has a way to fight their deportation, they may not have the money to do it. Language access is a huge issue also. For people who don't speak English or Spanish, they can have almost zero chance to communicate with people at the detention center. They may have trouble finding legal organizations that can take their case. For people who are Spanish speakers, they still face a lot of barriers to getting legal information and figuring out what their options are. Another issue is that there's just really few checks on immigration judges. So we see these huge disparities between judges. And to just give you an example, so an organization track compiled statistics on asylum grant rates, right? So which judges, how many asylum cases are each judge granting? And so to give you an example, the judge with the highest grant rate, Judge Dana Marks in San Francisco, granted 96% of asylum cases over the time frame they looked at, while there are two judges in Atlanta who granted less than 1% of asylum cases. So there's really no oversight of how these judges are treating cases, of how they're running their courtrooms. So in addition to people not winning their cases, they're also facing really abusive and just unprofessional conduct sometimes from judges. And CCIJ was actually part of a campaign in San Francisco to expose one immigration judge, Judge Nicholas Ford, who was just acting in a completely unacceptable way towards people in his courtroom. And he ultimately resigned. So again, people power for the win there. But this is what people are facing. And again, they're often facing this alone. And winning takes a long time. I always tell people the only thing that's quick in the immigration system is deportation. If someone wants to fight their case, they could be looking at months or years. And I think really the biggest limitation is the law itself. Especially for people with criminal convictions, the system is not designed for them to win. And the system really gives them very few options. And since 1986, most people who've been convicted of something called an aggravated felony, which ICE says are quote unquote serious criminal convictions, have really few options to fight their cases. But what an aggravated felony is it's pretty complicated and arbitrary to even know if someone's been convicted of one. And even as a lawyer, when I meet with people, I cannot tell sometimes. I have to do research because it doesn't have to be a felony. And what aggravated means is really complicated. So that means that when non-citizens are taking plea deals, right, that's how most criminal cases are resolved, they may have no idea that they're pleading to something that makes them deportable. So, there's so many more obstacles that I could mention, but I will just end by saying, for many people, because of these obstacles, immigration court is not the path to liberation. And for that reason, we know that alone is not going to lead to liberation, either individually for many people in immigration detention, but also collectively, right? We just saw that a judge in Louisiana said the Title 42 rule, which basically prevents any immigrants who want to come and seek protection from being able to do so at the border. A judge just said that has to stay in place, right? So we know the courts are not friendly to us. And even when they are friendly, we have to go to the Supreme Court, which we know is not, right? So the law is not going to save us. The law alone is not the answer because of all those difficulties.
Everyone except Ukrainians, Lisa, at the border.
Right. Oh, yeah. Except Ukrainians.
Yeah. There has been a huge disparity between how the U.S. has treated Ukrainian refugees and other refugees who have been waiting for years and have not received the same priority. So that really shows something. And Edwin, I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on Lisa's last point, because we saw that the law seems to fall short in a lot of cases. But I'm wondering now, from your perspective as an organizer, if you can share a little bit about what situations have been successful in community organizing, or what situations in which like the partnership between the legal and the organizing, because we do know that the legal part is also necessary. And so what are like those success stories, if you can share them with us?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's, I think we have to meet, as Lisa mentioned, yes, you need an attorney to look at your case and try to fight your case in immigration court. But at the same time, that call for universal representation, that call for the right to counsel and have an attorney needs to also be met with a sustainable community organizing strategy. Community members that are in court that are witnessing, like Lisa mentioned, this really abusive behavior from immigration judges against immigrants who are fighting their cases, and need to make sure that these judges know that the community is watching. These are public hearings, and at any moment, the public can go in and make sure that the judge knows and feels the pressure that folks are watching. But the ongoing pandemic, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted what we already knew, that detention kills, detention is deadly. And so we want to make sure that we keep sounding the alarm until we free everyone from immigration detention, till we shut down all of these detention facilities and terminate all of these contracts as well. And so I think, and CCIJ believes that one of the recipe for success, that recipe for liberation, is this community legal partnership. And we're really lucky that in Northern California and in the Bay Area, we have a long history of working in this community legal partnership, which means coordinating and sharing information to advance immigrant rights. And it was, as I mentioned, if you remember earlier on, if we rewind to the beginning of the panel, I talked about that the number of people in detention at its lowest point was 13,000 people in detention. Again, that didn't happen because one morning President Biden woke up and said, I'm going to release 10,000 people from detention. That didn't happen. That happened because community organizers and organizers like Serafin in immigration detention were coordinating an inside-outside strategy to make sure that people understood that, again, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic highlighted that these awful conditions accelerate the speed of which people come in contact with COVID-19. And it was in this relationship that we were able to monitor conditions, and that we have been doing for the past several years and decades. And we were able to also take down testimony. And it was because of this that we were able to bring lawsuits, not just in Northern and Central California and in Southern California, but all across the country. We were able to file lawsuits, not CCIJ, but partners and other litigators were able to bring these lawsuits forward. And so, people are always at risk when they're incarcerated, and the only solution is to release them. And as we know, we've been able to build this partnership. We've been able to share this information. So ICE and private prison operators know that they're being watched at every single moment during someone's incarceration. So I think it's really important for us to acknowledge and to think about how attorneys can take the lead from organizers, from people on the inside, and have that community strategy dictate the legal strategy as well. And so one of those examples that I want to talk about is actually a campaign that CCIJ was a part of, as well as many of our community partners in Northern California, the Free the U11 campaign, which was launched last year. And like I mentioned, the Yuba County Jail, which is very similar to the two facilities here in Wisconsin, has a contract directly with ICE. So an actual literal jail has a contract with ICE. And so because of all of the work that we had been doing with the community and with litigators, Yuba County Jail depopulated and ended up with 11 people in custody by March of 2021. And it was through this campaign that had two goals, okay? One was to liberate everyone in ICE custody at the Yuba County Jail. And the second goal was to terminate this contract between ICE and Yuba County. And this is the last contract that exists in California between a county jail and ICE. And this contract expires in the year 2099, okay, 2099. And this county is receiving $8.6 million to jail immigrants from our communities, instead of the community having improvements in public transportation and better access to water. I mean, the possibilities are endless when you have a county, when you have an area that is dependent on the incarceration of other people. The community misses out on opportunities and misses out on benefits. So in this case, the Yuba County, the Free the Yuba 11 campaign was a campaign that really focused on humanizing the stories of these 11 people. And I'll show a clip shortly of the people that were detained. We were able to learn so much about everyone in detention because we mentioned, right, 13,000, 36,000, 34,000 people. But these are real people. These are people who are skilled fishermen who go to Alaska and fish, right? Do commercial fishing. These are skilled mechanics, audio engineers, restaurant owners. They are members of our community, right? That are providing and are being are providing contributions to our community that often are overlooked and are just seen as a number. So in this campaign, we were able to pack the court, like I mentioned. We were able to witness the injustices that happen in immigration court. We were able to also provide financial support to those that decided for themselves that actually freedom meant deportation in some senses, because the conditions are so bad. This is done not on accident. It's done very purposefully and very intentionally to break people's spirits down, right? Serafin talked a little bit about that. And we were also able to organize and families to speak to congressional offices regarding the conditions at the Yuba County Jail, which resulted in a letter that the California delegation signed. 24 members of Congress in the California delegation signed this letter requesting the DHS Secretary Mayorkas to terminate this contract. And through this campaign in October 27th, of 2021, Ricardo Vasquez Cruz was the last person to be at Yuba to be released. And so that's something that we really were really happy about, because all of our pressure and all of our efforts worked. We actually found out through the deportation officer that the call for his release actually came from headquarters. It actually came from Washington, D.C. So that's when the law was closing its door on Ricardo to be released, it was actually the community that helped free him. So I'm going to play this clip really quickly for you all. See if we can see that. Okay. And ready, set, and go. Hopefully we can hear. There's Javier, Johnny, Minor, Freddie. Notice that how many months people were there. Way over a year. And Ricardo. 4 individuals chose, again, deportation as a form of their freedom. And then we had a celebration for Ricardo at that point, that we were able to celebrate his release. And he was there in Dolores Park in San Francisco, thanking the community for all of their pressure and all of their support. And that's something we draw from our lessons learned from this campaign, that in fact, the Community Legal Partnership can see a world without cages and can see a world where people can choose their freedom once and for all. So it's something that really continues to inspire me.
Thanks so much, Edwin. Yeah, and it's also important to state that unfortunately Yuba County Jail was populated again. Right now there's 4 people detained there. But like the Yuba 11, campaign showed us, and what Lisa was mentioning before, when ICE was saying that people had to be in detention and that these people had, reasons why they were a danger to society. But then we saw that the 11 individuals, out of the 11 individuals, 7 were released into their communities, and they're doing great. And it just comes to show that detention is not necessary, one, and that 2, ICE has the full discretion to be able to release folks like they did with those 7 individuals. So thank you so much for sharing that. And you were talking at the beginning about the importance of organizing on the inside, and we're lucky enough to have an inside organizer here with us, So, like we mentioned, Serafin, organizing doesn't only happen on the outside, and I know that you've been working on that for several months. So can you tell us what motivated you to start as an organizer?
Yes. What I've kind of learned is that organizing is a process, right? And after going from state prison to detention, I see many of the same similarities in regards to the confinement, the treatment, and the programming. My experiences have taught me to advocate for myself, especially now that I'm here in detention, when we're constantly being reminded, that we're not prisoners, that our confinement is for civil detention. Yet, the daily dehumanizing treatment, the harassment, and even the criminalization by officers proves to me and others, otherwise. And, this is why making my advocacy and my organizing in the inside even more crucial. It has impacted others to find their own voice and agency in their own fight for their liberation, to better their living conditions, and to not allow their rights to be violated. We have built a community of solidarity and brotherhood in here that, in order to face the daily challenges, for example, like translating for those who can't speak English, helping out with legal forms, and even trying to find others, the legal resources and help that they need. We understand that the limitations within the facility regarding programming and recreational activities have motivated us to explore other avenues in order to continue with our rehabilitation, our self-growth, our betterment. And so we started an Alcoholics Anonymous group where the preparation, the material, and the facilitation is done by us. As a result of our initiative and the collaboration of all of us, this has allowed, all of us, to see the results of our collective initiative, because we know from our experiences that this facility will never invest in this kind of self-help programming for us. For them, spending money in order for us to better ourselves is not in their future, because all they want to do is profit off of us, and, we'll get deported or whatever happens, and that's it.
I love that with what you're sharing. You can feel that these detention centers and ICE are trying to put limitations, and what y'all are doing is like finding the little holes between those limitations and just expanding. And I really love that and commend you for that, because I know it's not easy, and it really is truly inspiring, and we're all learning from all the organizing going on the inside. I know that before you were sharing a little bit about the food conditions, and I just wanted to say that we're going to drop in the chat a food report that CCIJ created in hand with detained organizers and folks inside who shared their experiences with us through surveys and through testimonies, and we were able to compile all that information and put out this food report called Starving for Justice. So be sure to check it out, and that will give you a little bit more of an idea of what those food conditions are like, not only here in California, but throughout all of the United States in these detention centers. And now that we heard Serafin talk about what he has done as an organizer, why don't we see him in action? We actually have a clip from one of his campaigns to reinstate visitation. And so, yeah, I'd love for us to see that so we can see Serafin in action.
Was detained by ICE on June 4th, July 12th, and July 14, 2021. We all have family and loved ones that miss us.
It's hard being away from family and our community.
Holidays such as Christmas, Thanksgiving, New Year's, and now Valentine's are hard because we are not with our loved ones.
Now, according to ICE guidelines, visitations are allowed during set hours for weekends and holidays.
However, it's been almost 2 years since visits were suspended in all detention centers across the country. Join us so we can demand that the Biden administration reinstates visits so we can see our loved ones again.
Please join our campaign by signing up on the form below to help us out.
awesome. I love watching that video.
I love that video. Yes.
And Serafin, can you share a little bit about that campaign, where it's at right now? Because that video was from February, back when it hadn't been 2 years, but it has been past those 2 years since visitation was suspended in detention centers. So can you share a little bit about that campaign with us?
Yes. So this was a community effort, and like I said, suspended. Visits were suspended, in-person visitation was suspended since the pandemic started, and there have been no efforts by ICE or any of the facilities to reinstate the visitations. And even though there have been safeguards that have been implemented, like vaccinations and all those things, to kind of prevent COVID from coming in here, and yet there still haven't been making any efforts. So that was one of the reasons too why I was inspired to kind of join that campaign and put my efforts into it, because it's already stressful enough being isolated and being confined in here, and not being able to see family, friends, loved ones. It's even harder. Now, through our efforts of writing letters and making videos like this, it has allowed at least ICE to review the guidelines and the policies and to implement visitation back into the facilities, which some may have already started doing, but still, for us here at Mesa Verde, we haven't heard anything in the efforts of them trying to reinstate them, when they could possibly happen or anything like that.
Yeah, that's right. Like, I think it was 2 weeks ago that ICE announced that they were going to reinstate visitations, and it's still, up in the air. We have no idea what's going to happen with a lot of detention centers. They have not said anything about it. So it is very inconsistent, like you were mentioning, Serafin, and it's very frustrating, I can imagine. I want to end with a question for all of you. And, we have three perspectives here that tie up into the same fight. And I'm wondering, from each of those perspectives, how do you think we can implement that community legal partnership? I don't know who wants to take it on first. Maybe Serafin, why don't you get us started?
Okay. Thank you. So the way I feel is there's no accountability for the detention facilities. They don't follow the performance-based national detention standards, and when we file grievances, it gets us nowhere, right? It's like we hit a dead end. They don't acknowledge it, they don't follow it, and they pretty much just dismiss any of our concerns that we file through these grievances. And then also too, when we do such things, we're always being labeled as troublemakers or that we're causing, trouble. So these are some of the challenges that we have to face, and also too the retaliation. When we expose the facilities' inhumane treatment, the medical negligence, just the terrible living conditions in general while we're in here. They commonly use tactics to try and dissuade people and organizers. For example, write them up, or threaten them with solitary confinement, or to transfer them to another facility. However, with the community being aware and supporting us and what we're doing to try to better our living conditions, and just trying to advocate to be treated as people, as humans, and just for our rights, right? It can actually stop the facility from these forms of retaliation, because they're put on the spotlight that, look, if we're being treated wrong, then the community is going to be aware, the public is going to be aware, and that puts pressure on them so that they don't perform those retaliations.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm wondering, Lisa, if you can share a little bit from your perspective.
Yeah, so I think I said earlier that, the law is not the path to collective liberation or individual liberation for a lot of people. But I do think it can be a useful tool, but lawyers really have to respond to community needs. And I think as a lawyer, the way we're trained, right, is not to do that. The way we're trained is that we have an individual client, we know best, right, and we'll tell the client, excuse me, how to win their case. But that's not the path. Excuse me. That isn't gonna get us to liberation. So what lawyers need to do is take on the hard cases, right, to support organizing. So don't be afraid to take on a case that might be tough, right, if it's going to support the broader movement. And lawyers need to work with community in service of those larger goals. And that sometimes can mean sharing decision-making, right, with the community, that maybe a person has broader goals besides winning their case. They also want information to be shared out, right? They want the community to be present. And lawyers need to be a part of that. And I think above all, it means finding creative solutions. And that includes things outside the law, right? I think lawyers, sometimes we can have a lot of access and a lot of privilege within the detention system. And we need to use that. So, for example, it may be helping organizers inside get the word out about conditions, right? It may be maybe being on ice about failure to provide medical care, about the food, right? All of these things that they do to break people down in detention, and that aren't strictly immigration law or legal issues, but a lawyer can use their privilege to address. So, I encourage folks who are lawyers to think about what are the issues people are facing and how can we respond, right? And what is the community saying they need versus, what is my job or what is my sort of legal strategy? And I encourage people who are thinking about working with lawyers to find lawyers, right, that will do that, and to let them know kind of what you need from them. And you don't want to work with lawyers who are sort of dictating to you. And there are some of us out there who are down to really support the organizing and advocacy work. And I think there's more of us every day who really want to do that and take the lead from the community.
Yes, I love that. And before we hear from Edwin, I just want to invite folks, if you have any questions and want to ask them, now's the time to do so. So as Edwin's talking to us about this, we can start gathering those questions. So Edwin, yeah, we'd love to hear from your perspective. How does that look like? How does that partnership look like?
Yeah, I talked a little bit about it throughout this panel, but I really want to uplift what Serafin and Lisa mentioned. A lot of my organizing friends and mentors always say that organizing is about building trust, right? You need to build trust with people in detention. You need to build trust with families. You need to build trust with certain attorneys that want to make sure that they're following the community strategy, and that's dictating the legal strategy here, right? It's a community legal partnership at the end of the day. And also is making sure, like Serafin said, right? And as Lisa mentioned, we talked about this. These facilities are not in downtown San Francisco or downtown Milwaukee or in a big city. These facilities are in remote places, right? They're out in the middle of nowhere for a reason, right? So no one knows what's going on inside. So they're not receiving the heat from the community pressure. And so this is our opportunity for us to build those relationships with people in detention and help kind of help dictate, help expose conditions inside, right? And Serafin mentioned the retaliation piece, making sure that we are pressuring ICE to stop the retaliation, stop using solitary confinement as a form to retaliate. And the list goes on, but really is, exposing as much as possible these conditions, having an aggressive media strategy, making sure that people are not only advancing their own personal goals in their cases, but also broader goals for liberation. So again, the list goes on. We could talk about this specific piece for a long time, but definitely want to uplift what Lisa and Serafin mentioned in their responses. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for all of your amazing insight. It really is an honor to hear from all of your experiences and all of your knowledge. And with this, we're going to wrap up. But I do invite folks, if you want to learn more about CCIJ, about what we do, our work, you can visit our website at ccijustice.org, and you can find us on social media at CCIJustice. It was truly an honor to be part of this social justice panel. We really appreciate it. Thank you, No Studios, and thank you, Edwin, Lisa, Serafin, for being here with me.
Yes, thanks, Lau, for moderating. Thanks, Serafin, for your time.
Thank you, Edward, Lisa, Laura, everyone, audience, No Studios. Thanks, all of you.
Yes, thank you all so much. It was a pleasure to be able to speak on this and to share space with my colleagues and with Serafin.